Today's topic is post-wildfire seeding, and I'm really excited personally to hear this presentation because not only is the content interesting, obviously this is a topic of some concern across a lot of different landscapes, but also the methodology that the team that's on this first slide took, the approach they took to answering this question, I think may become the sort of new paradigm. But I won't try to steal the thunder, and I'll turn it over to Pete Fulé from Northern Arizona University to start the presentation. So it's all yours, Pete.
Thank you very much, Xander. I hope everyone can hear this okay and see it all right on the screen. This work is led by Donna Pepin, who recently completed her master's degree at NAU, and you see that she's listed as the lead person here. Unfortunately, or fortunately for her, she just took a new job, but unfortunately for us, that meant that she wasn't able to give the presentation here today. So I'm going to fill in. I am less expert in the topics of this review than Donna is, but I, as Xander mentioned, put my email in the chat box and would be happy to respond to any further questions or follow up if there's anything that I can't answer during this webinar. And I wanted to encourage people to please use the chat box if you have questions, or I'll pause from time to time and see if there are any questions. The other folks listed here, Jan Byers, Carolyn Sieg, are both with Forest Service Research, and then Molly Hunter with Northern Arizona University School of Forestry. So we are the team that put together this project for the Joint Fire Science Program. I want to stop right there and just see if there are any questions right off the bat or if there are any technical issues. Okay, looks like we're doing well. So this review addressed three different topics: the effectiveness of post-wildfire seeding, trends over time in post-wildfire seeding, and the perspectives of various managers involved in this aspect of fire rehabilitation. There's been some post-wildfire seeding has been very widely used in the United States, perhaps more than just about anywhere else. But there are also some concerns about the overall effectiveness of these treatments. They cost a fair bit of money. Sometimes they do not necessarily result in high vegetation cover. And they can have certain negative effects because we, especially in the past, have typically seeded non-native species, which may persist over time. They may suppress some native species recovery, and they may change some fuel characteristics. So in the year 2000, Peter Robichaud and others published a comprehensive review of post-fire rehabilitation treatments, describing all the literature that was available up to that point. In 2004, Jan Byers published a review that brought the Robichaud et al. Review up to date and focused specifically on seeding. Our review now, in 2010, is bringing the literature up to date again and using a somewhat different format, as Xander mentioned. Some of the issues that make it timely to have a new review that everybody on this webinar is well aware of: the increasing size and severity of wildfires, the fact that we're putting more money into seeding, concern on the part of agencies and also non-governmental organizations to try to encourage more use of native species. And there's been a lot of research in the last 10 years on the effect of post-fire seeding. So the Joint Fire Science Program, Xander mentioned this is an interagency effort on the part of U.S. Department of Interior and the Forest Service to look at all kinds of issues around fire sciences, put together a call a couple of years ago for what they called synthesis. In other words, bringing together, not carrying out new research to put in new plots and start new projects and so on, but rather to synthesize what we already know and make it accessible to managers. And the group of us applied and received funding to carry out this review. Our topics are the ones, the three topics showing on the screen right now. So first, an evidence-based systematic review of what is known about post-wildfire seeding. Secondly, an analysis of USDA Forest Service burned area reports to show the trends in recent years of post-wildfire seeding. And the third category was discussion and a survey of managers involved in carrying out these activities. On the screen it says fire managers, but we're not talking about FMOs and so on. We're rather talking about managers who are working specifically in post-wildfire rehabilitation. So the topics for the first part of this, which is the evidence-based systematic review, are: does seeding after severe forest fires reduce soil erosion? Is seeding effective at reducing non-native plant invasion into burned areas? And does post-fire seeding affect native plant community recovery? The idea of this evidence-based systematic review is that it follows a rigorous predetermined protocol. And one place that anybody who's interested in this topic can get more information is from the organization shown on the screen, the Center for Evidence-Based Conservation, which is an international organization. It's headquartered in England, that sponsors, encourages the use of evidence-based systematic reviews in conservation. Now, for many of us, this may be a topic that's already familiar to you. For me, it was a relatively new topic a few years ago when I started learning about how these evidence-based systematic reviews work. Basically, we're all quite familiar. Oh, thank you, Xander. I see you just posted the website on the chat. We're all pretty familiar with literature reviews where a scientist or group of scientists will take an area of the literature, the scientific literature, and go through and try to find out what the key themes are, what the key findings are, and summarize those things. The difference in the systematic review approach is that you follow a specific protocol that's aimed at trying to be sure that you are completely inclusive of the literature, so that you're not, let's say, missing some literature that may be published in forums that are sometimes less accessible. For instance, it's the case in forestry that we have a lot of things published in conference proceedings or in management documents that may be less accessible than what's published in forestry journals. Another feature of the systematic review is that we're also trying to look not only at how many papers have found result A or result B. This is kind of a counting operation where you say, well, 10 papers found that this treatment was successful and 4 papers found that it was not, that kind of a thing. That is part of it. But what we're also trying to do is look at the quality of that evidence. And quality here is not intended as a subjective thing, but rather an objective way of rating the strength or the reliability of different research projects and conclusions. And I'll show you more examples of that in a minute. So the search strategy, which is showing on the screen now, included looking at scientific journals, of course, looking at what we call the gray literature. This can be conference proceedings, some of which are not peer-reviewed, some of which are peer-reviewed, but perhaps to a somewhat different standard than what you might find in archived literature. Looking at unpublished documents like theses and dissertations, and looking at management documents, management reports. The criteria for including material in the review was that we were focused on seeding in forested ecosystems. And let me mention at this point that there is a parallel project for seeding in range ecosystems, led by Dave Pike and Jan Byers as well. They were also funded by Joint Fire Science, and their results will be coming out shortly. So the idea was to have a kind of comprehensive look at post-wildfire seeding, but to have it range from rangelands at lower elevations up into forests. And so our break point is forests. We're looking from 1970 to the present, looking at seeding after wildfires, but we also included prescribed burning because a substantial amount of the literature actually comes from prescribed burning, where people were more able to have experimental control on the results of their burning. It could be seeding alone or in combination with other activities, aerially or ground-based. And then the response variables, item 6 here, are changes in plant community or soil stabilization. So these papers were searched for using electronic search engines, using some academic search engines, and then other things like Google Scholar that are widely available. Searching on keywords, then once papers were selected, they were reviewed. Donna did the first cut at review, and then papers that we decided to keep in the systematic review were assigned to all of the other members of the group. Basically, each paper was read twice, and we set up a spreadsheet to record all the basic data about what these treatments showed, how successful they were, what the quality of evidence was, and so forth. Let me stop for a second and see if anyone has any questions or comments at this point. Gives me a second to take a drink as well. Okay. So these are the quality of evidence criteria showing on the screen now. So we have, in the case of replicated controlled experiments, where the experimenter controlled the application of the seeding in this case, this gives us the most statistically robust, the most independent experimental units to analyze. And this works its way down in the medium category is a type of research that's quite common in fire situations because we often can't really control things that well. We have an area that burned, we might have an unburned area next to it, and so this is an observational study. The data can still be very useful, obviously. In fact, a lot of our fire ecology data come from those kind of studies, but we can't say for sure that the fire necessarily caused all the effects because there could have been pre-existing factors about the burned area that make it different than the unburned area. When we get to the lowest quality of evidence, that's where we don't have replication, we don't have control, and we may not even have quantitative data. Nobody may even have measured which species were out there, what their cover may have been, and so on. And actually, if you search on this kind of literature, there actually is a fair amount of these lower quality type of reports out in the past. For instance, there may have been a fire, some folks seeded it and went out a year later, took a couple of photographs and said, this looks really good to us. So that is a form of evidence, but clearly it's one that's a little bit less reliable and certainly less quantitative than a designed experiment. The other question that we had in terms of the different topics of the review, like how much plant cover was established, how successfully was erosion reduced, how much was the native plant community changed. So we analyzed those things in terms of effectiveness. And here too you have a list ranging from effective to ineffective, where there was, in the case of an effective increase in plant cover, for instance, this would be where you have a statistically significant increase in plant cover, say 1 year or 2 years after fire, in a set of seeded areas versus a set of control unseeded areas. Okay? And then we could also have some effectiveness, no difference, or we could have treatments that are ineffective. So a total of 94 papers were reviewed. The map shows their distribution across the western U.S. A number of these were review papers already, like the Robichaud and Byers paper that I mentioned. You can see in the circled states of Washington, California, and Colorado that those were the places that the largest number of papers came from. Wyoming, Utah, and North Dakota had none. The Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico is pretty well represented. So let's look at the first set of results. These are soil erosion results. And here's where you can see how the effectiveness ratings and the quality of evidence issue comes into play. So if you look on the table in blue there and look at the first row shaded in gray, it's called effectiveness ratings. There are 27 papers that we were able to get quantitative data and assess their effectiveness. So the next set of numbers going to the right are all percents. So we have under percent effective, 33%, or 1/3 are saying that these post-wildfire seedings were effective, 33% of the 27 papers, okay? 26%, the next one to the right, says minimally effective, 26% says ineffective, 15% no difference. So what we have is, if you add up the 33% and the 26%, you have about 59%, close to 60%, that are at least to some extent effective. However, if we filter by quality of evidence, and we show here only the papers of highest and high quality evidence, so these are going to be the ones that did have controls and some level of replication, we find that we drop down from 27 papers down to 12 papers, and of those, only 8%, which would be one paper, found the post-wildfire seeding to be effective, 16%, or two more papers, minimally effective, and 58% ineffective. In the bullet right below this table, the basic point is that the highest and high quality papers, most of those were published since 2000. And this was a general finding of the review, that most of the papers that really used what you could consider robust experimental and statistical methods, that had controls, that had some ability to really statistically draw some strong conclusions about seeding, most of those were published since 2000. Another trend that you see in this table, and that tended to be true throughout the review process, was that the more recent and more experimentally sound papers also tended to show more mixed results or less effectiveness of seeding compared to the total. So this is where the review really picks out the differences. If we were just counting numbers of papers and saying, well, which ones were positive and which ones were negative, we would come up with about a 60-40% in favor of showing that post-wildfire seeding had some positive effects on soil erosion. But if we look at the higher quality and more recent papers, then it changes to about 60%, actually more like 75%, showing either ineffectiveness or no difference. So a pretty big change over time in terms of the strength of the research that's being done out there, and also the conclusions that you draw from that kind of research. Turning to further look at soil erosion, the table that's shown on the screen right now discusses the number of papers, or the number of sites, study sites within papers, where cover measurements were taken. And this is divided in the center of the table into two categories: sites that showed 30% or more cover and 60% or more cover in the first year and the second year after fire. The reason that this is important is that rehabilitation specialists and soil scientists have suggested that if you can achieve approximately 60% ground cover, not just the vegetation, but vegetation and other organic materials. So it could be litter, or it could be a mulch that's added, something like that. But if you can get about 60% ground cover within the first year after a fire, then you are likely to have very minimal soil movement or soil erosion. If you can get 30%, you're likely to see some reduction compared to less than 30%. But 30% would be like a lower target, 60% would be an ideal target for trying to prevent soil erosion. And what we see here is that seeding does seem to make a difference in both years. There are more papers in year one, but we see a higher proportion of sites, seeded sites than unseeded sites, making it to the 30% threshold. Overall, much fewer proportion of sites made it to the 60% threshold, but there as well, there was a pretty good increase in the seeded sites had substantially higher number of 60% cover than the unseeded sites. However, if we look to the right-hand side of this table, there were some studies that also actually measured soil erosion. So when we use the cover thresholds as categories or cutoffs for saying whether or not we're successful, that's a proxy for what we're really trying to get at, which is whether or not there's actually some erosion going on. So what we see on the right-hand side is that of sites that actually showed measurements of erosion, we have very little support there, either in year one or year two, for statistically significant reductions in erosion associated with seeding. So the bottom line here is that seeding does appear to be helpful in meeting the 60% cover threshold. However, this is only 10 sites or 12 sites for year two or year one, but there's relatively little evidence that reaching that threshold necessarily reduces erosion. Okay, non-native species. Here we had a very mixed bag, and here there's very little difference by applying the quality of evidence using papers of highest and high quality evidence. And that's because most of the papers that talk about non-native species were already relatively recent and using higher quality evidence methods. In other words, using controlled replicated studies. The reason is that the use of non-native species, as we'll talk about a little bit later on here, is relatively recent. And so it's only in the last decade or so that people have begun using a lot of native species and paying attention to the effects of non-native species in post-wildfire seeding. So what this table shows is that the results are about split. About half of the post-wildfire seeding studies that describe the plant community and the effects on non-native species are effective, and about half are ineffective. Most of the treatments that were used in these papers incorporated annual non-native species, whether they were effective or not. They were all using, or most of them, about 80% of them were using non-native species. There's also an issue, and one line of research, especially in the Southwest that came out of the Cerro Grande fire in New Mexico, talks about the proportion of seed mixes that are contaminated with undesirable species. So that's a fairly big issue and problem in parts of the country. So the table that's showing on the screen right now gives a summary of plant cover results based on 57 study sites. Some individual papers had more than one study site, so it's fewer than that papers. So if you look first at the red line shows the percent cover. This is the midpoint of a pretty broad distribution of a bunch of study sites. But the midpoint rises from about 25% cover or so on the red line in year 1, peaks at about 50% or so in year 3, and kind of tapers off a little bit after that. So that red line represents the change in plant cover of unseeded or control sites following severe wildfires. If we compare that to the dotted blue line shows the total cover in sites that were seeded. And then the third line on there is the green dashed line, and that shows the cover of the seeded species themselves. So in other words, if you look at the blue line in year 1, it's about 35% or so. If you look at the dashed green line below it, it's about 25%. So what that's saying is the midpoint of all these sites that were seeded, about 25% cover made up by the seeded species and another 10% by other species that were not seeded. I hope that's clear. This graph, I think, is a little bit confusing at times. But if we follow what happens then with the total cover, the dotted blue line over time, basically after 3 years it starts to become very similar to the control. So in the last few years after seeding, what you have is essentially no difference in whether the site was seeded or not. But you do have something of a difference in the first 3 years. The dotted blue line is higher than the red line, and to some extent that's made up by the seeded species themselves. The seeded species tend to drop out somewhat after year 3, and they bottom out at about 10% in year 5. Okay. One other point about this graph, these lines are just showing the center points of a pretty big distribution of studies. There are some places that had much higher cover in year 1 and 2, some places that had practically no cover in the first few years after fire. So the variability out there is really high. But if you look at these midpoints, you see this trend for a little bit more plant cover in the seeding in the first years, and then the seeded species generally dropping out after that. In terms of richness of native species, not a whole lot of papers on this topic, but most of them found reduced native species richness in seeded areas, and then found that basically, which you might expect, when the native species were reduced in richness, that was when the seeded species tended to have a fair bit of dominance on the sites. Woody plant establishment is another question that people have addressed in research, and basically the majority of papers found reduced establishment of woody species, and in the case of the best quality of evidence, which is only a small number of papers, about half and half, negative effects on tree seedlings or shrubs. This used to be a more important issue in post-fire rehabilitation because managers used to be extremely concerned about getting forest cover back on all sites and trying to regain their full stocking essentially after a severe fire. In the last decade or even 15 years or so, people have been more looking at ecosystem level responses and a little bit less concerned about making sure that it got back into being a forest. So this question of woody plant establishment was a bit reduced. So in summarizing the systematic review results, we see in terms of soil erosion that seeding is somewhat affected, limited effectiveness. That graph that we just looked through with the red and blue lines showed a small but still present effectiveness in increasing plant cover. However, those experiments that actually looked at the reduction of erosion, not just using plant cover as a proxy, but actually measuring erosion, showed really no significant reduction in erosion compared to unseeded treatments. Recommendation coming out of this review, and actually going back to the Robichaud et al. Review in 2000, was to consider alternative treatments such as mulching or no action following severe fires. In terms of non-native species, seeding was effective about 50% of the time, but even when the seeding is effective, it's also introducing, it has in the past also introduced non-native species, some of which might be persistent. And it is possible, it's certainly not conclusively shown, but it's possible that there could be other additional negative impacts on native plant communities if those non-native seeded species persist. So the potential recommendation here is perhaps not so much to focus on large-scale seeding to try to control non-natives, but rather use early detection and rapid response methods for the non-natives when they appear specifically, rather than seeding the entire landscape. In terms of plant communities, we do see, as we've discussed, some increase in plant cover in the first few years. Over the long term, plant cover seems to be equal to that of unseeded sites. The seeded species do decline rapidly, but have some ability to persist in the community. And there's the possibility that when seeded non-natives establish rapidly, that could suppress native species. This last bullet item on the screen, the rapid establishment of seeded non-natives, that's written a little more strongly, I think, than our data would really support. John Keeley in California has done a couple of good studies really showing this in the case where wheat was planted and dominated a site and therefore caused what he called a vacuum after the wheat died out and the native species weren't really there to reestablish. But I wouldn't say that that's a general finding. A recommendation to improve our knowledge of this issue is to have longer-term monitoring, more than 5 years, to assess the lasting impacts of seeded species. I'm going to stop here for a second because we have finished this first topic, which was the systematic review of the literature, and see if anybody has any questions.
Hey, Pete, this is Jared Scott here.
Hey, Jared.
I have a question about the erosion. You were talking about how there was no significant differences, but I was wondering if there were any trends, non-significant trends, such as any reduction in the seeded areas.
I see what you're saying. So most of these studies are done with some sort of sediment trap that's placed in the watershed to try to quantitatively measure the amount of sediment coming out in runoff. And honestly, I don't know the answer as to whether or not there were any trends. One of the features of this review, and actually I neglected to mention at the beginning, but Donna's paper on this topic, her manuscript on this topic was just accepted by the journal Forest Ecology and Management and is going to be published probably in a few months here. And that paper will have an appendix that lists all of the original data sources. But that particular question, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to. Any other questions?
Hey, this is Xander Evans, and I was curious whether the systematic review, in implementing it, you noticed that it took a lot more time, was a lot easier, was about the same as a traditional sort of literature review.
The systematic review definitely takes a lot more time and effort than a traditional review. Now, I got to caveat that by saying that in a traditional review, of course, one of the sort of problems with that is that you as the writer can decide to some extent how much you want to undertake. But it is rarely the case that traditional reviews gather as much information and as thoroughly as one does when you have this systematic review protocol laid out. And by the way, you not only create this protocol and you follow, in our case, we followed the guidelines of that organization we were discussing, the Center for Evidence-Based Conservation. But then they post it on their website and they solicit reviews of your protocol. So before you even start reviewing, you have this kind of peer-reviewed protocol to guide you. The other big factor that's not exclusively related to the systematic review approach, it's true for any review that one does now, is that we just have a lot more tools available to us online. We're able to get to more publications, including journals and management documents that are harder to find. We're able to do a better job of searching for those and therefore come up with more information. But it was a pretty intensive methodology. The foundings of evidence-based reviews come from medicine, and I've found this to be kind of an interesting insight into how this procedure developed, because there's medical research going on all the time, all around the world. Lots and lots of things are being found, but yet practicing doctors don't have time to subscribe to all kinds of journals and sit down and read all these articles and things like that. So in medicine, going back for a number of years, they have put together organizations and guidelines for how to do evidence-based reviews in order to try to bring together the best possible medical information that can be summarized in a short document for practitioners. And some of the folks who set up the CEBC are leaders in trying to convert that idea to having greater use in conservation. Okay, any other questions? Let me move on to the next topic here, which is trends in post-fire seeding. We're interested in the trends of especially native species over time and other trends related to things like costs, money spent on seeding, and areas seeded. And the data source here included any of the literature in the systematic review that talked about these issues of costs or acreages and so on. But the main source here was the burned area reports from the Forest Service. And Peter Robichaud has put together a database with summaries of over 1,000 USDA burned area reports. And this includes most of the western United States, although as it says on the screen, there are some missing data from certain regions and certain periods. But Robichaud, who collaborated with us on this part of the project, has put together the most thorough possible set of information about bear reports. So here again, we had inclusion criteria that we were looking for seeding in forested ecosystems and so on. When we were talking about whether plants were native or not, we used the NRCS plants database to specify nativity. And all the spending figures that I'm going to show you here are adjusted to $2009. So if we say that spending increased or decreased or whatever, it's all in a common time point for the currency. Okay, so in the first question here, trends of specific species, especially native species over time, had 40 papers, 67 burned area reports covering 122 fires over 36 years. And the graph that shows on the screen right now shows the big trends going on in time. So if you look at this graph, the bottom timeline is 1970 to 2006. You can see the red bars. These are seeding with non-native perennials. And if you just kind of even sort of close your eyes a little bit and squint at this graph, you'll see that there's a lot of red right up through the early 1990s, really starts petering out after about 1995, and relatively little red showing in the last 15 years or so, last 11 years or so. Seeding with natives is indicated with the yellow bars. And you can see that there was some seeding with natives going way back in time, and some of these might be species like wheatgrasses that were native to certain areas that were reseeded, but are nonetheless easy to cultivate, easy to propagate, and relatively inexpensive. But the seeding with natives definitely increased in the late 80s and especially took off in the 1990s. And then the third category are sterile or annual non-natives. And that category has increased as well, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. And the idea there is that these are non-native species that can be relatively inexpensive, that can establish and grow quite well, but that will be eliminated quite quickly from the ecosystem. So that's our major trend that we see here in this about 35 years of data, is a shift away from non-native perennials to native species, or non-natives that are intended to go away quickly. In terms of other post-fire seeding trends, especially cost and area, we looked at 380 burned area reports over, again, about that same time period. And what we see is a pretty substantial increase in total seeding expenditures within the BEAR, or Forest Service Burned Area Emergency Response Program. The graph here, recall that this is all in 2009 dollars, so the dollar, it's fair to compare dollar amounts in different years. And most of those funds were spent on National Forest System lands, but some on other lands, which would be adjacent parks or private lands or state lands. The majority of that money was spent in our region, in Region 3. Not the majority, but the biggest fraction of all this spending. And then the Intermountain and Rocky Mountain regions followed us pretty closely. However, despite the fact that we're spending more money, the percent of burned area that is seeded is decreasing. And that decrease is particularly prominent after the early 1990s. At least one reason for this trend is that the sizes of fires have increased dramatically, and so in burned area rehabilitation, it's been necessary to prioritize which areas are going to get seeded. However, if you spend more money and you seed fewer acres or hectares, then the cost per acre or hectare is going to increase over time. And so we have costs here on this graph per hectare going from about say $70 or so in the 1970s per hectare, which would be on the order of, say, $30 an acre, up to about $150 or so per hectare today, which would be about $70 or so per acre. So the main trends are summarized on this slide. We have an increasing use of native species and annual cereal grains or hybrids, with native species dominating the seed mixes in recent years. The total Forest Service BEAR seeding expenditures have increased substantially in the last 10 years. But at the same time, smaller proportions of burned areas have been seeded annually at higher cost per seeded acre, likely due to the increased use of additional treatments and costlier native species. So as we shift into using more native species, the costs tend to rise. And it's really unclear what the effects might be of using either the sterile or annual non-native species, or even in the case of using native species, whether if we're using non-local genotypes that are not locally adapted, whether that might be causing some problems. That's not something we could answer right here. We just listed nativity following those NRCS guidelines, but it's a question for future research. So the last topic that we're going to cover here is our discussions with fire managers, or really rehabilitation specialists or rehabilitation managers, perceptions and opinions on these post-wildfire seeding activities and decisions in forested ecosystems of the West. And this was done in two parts. The first part were people who were called key informants. And these were in-person interviews with a selected group of leaders who are knowledgeable about post-wildfire seeding activities at the national level. And as it turned out, because of a transition going on in the Forest Service, all the key informants who were interviewed were with the Department of Interior. So the Bureau of Land Management, BIA, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service. And in talking with these key informants, the idea was to understand the objectives of the two programs, the BEAR program, Burned Area Emergency Rehabilitation in the Forest Service, and the Emergency Stabilization and Burned Area Rehabilitation Program in the Department of Interior agencies. There are some differences between the way that the USDA and USDI agencies address burned area rehabilitation. And so a little bit you should know that a little bit of our key informant results are skewed by the fact that we did not have Forest Service representation in those interviews. We talked about post-wildfire seeding policies and objectives, and then the monitoring of post-wildfire seeding effectiveness. In this case, not effectiveness as measured by the literature like in the systematic review, but effectiveness in the opinion of some of the key leaders that are carrying out these activities. We also followed up on the key informant interviews with telephone surveys of regional natural resource managers and specialists involved in these activities in all of the agencies, and there were a number of Forest Service representatives in this group. So we included 19 fire managers and had 30 interview questions about monitoring, how available was the information, what did they see in terms of seeding success and effectiveness, etc. The results, the data sets were analyzed with the statistical package for the social sciences, and we calculated the answer frequencies for all these different questions. So in summary of the data set that we had 6 key informant interviews, completed 17 telephone surveys, about a 90% response rate. 62% of the people we talked with had worked with post-wildfire seedings for over a decade, a quarter of them for over 20 years. And we're just going to show a small subset of the results here. So one major finding was that basically we're not monitoring well enough post-wildfire seeding treatments. And we're not monitoring them well enough not because we don't care or because we don't want to, but there's a lack of sufficient funding dedicated to these activities and available personnel. And there are many priorities in land management, and so carrying out post-fire seeding monitoring is not something that is always possible to be done. There's also fairly short time frames. In many cases, for many variables of the Forest Service, there's only 1 year of monitoring. For the Department of Interior agencies, 3 years of monitoring. And that's a relatively short time frame to really understand the ecological effects of seeding. On the other hand, in defense of the way that the policies were set up, these treatments were designed to produce rehabilitation results within about a year, so a relatively short monitoring protocol would make sense for things like cover or soil erosion. But as ecosystem managers, a lot of our questions really get at plant community questions that go a lot longer than just 1 year. The managers think that what's needed is increased funding and dedicated monitoring staff, improved and more consistent monitoring protocols, and the ability to extend monitoring out to 5 to 10 years in order to make better informed decisions about post-wildfire seeding practices. Many of the folks that we talked with stressed the need for improved availability of seeding treatment information and really asked, is the information available to evaluate the long-term benefits of post-fire seeding treatments? And they felt that this information really was not available at present. My apologies for the image on the screen there. It appears like we weren't able to show it. Oh, I know what it was, Xander. That was one of those bar graphs, and I guess that didn't work out.
Yeah, sorry. I tried to fix that. I guess it didn't work.
It was just a bar graph summarizing what these managers said. The type of thing that they recommended would be useful would be a centralized and interagency way to have data that can be entered and accessed by people in agencies all around the country and in USDA and USDI organizations. and they felt that the current reporting system on post-fire rehabilitation activities was not well suited for this kind of monitoring approach. In terms of seeding success and effectiveness, the most commonly used application technique, as you can see here, was aerial application of seeds, followed by hand application and seed drilling. Now, if you look at the next slide here, which ones are the most effective? Well, you'll notice that there weren't a whole lot of votes for aerial application as being the most effective. So we may be using practices that perhaps are more efficient or perhaps economically efficient, or that we're set up to do in terms of aerial distribution of seed, but it may not necessarily be the most effective way to get seeds on the ground. Managers found at least somewhat to very effective not seeding, just using natural regeneration, as you can see on the graph here. And the key factor for whether or not seeding treatments are going to be successful is the post-fire weather environment. So if we seed and we don't get any rain, then we're not going to get much establishment of the seeded species. If we seed and get really severe thunderstorms that wash the seeds off of the area that they've been broadcast to, then again, we're not going to get very good results. On the other hand, if we find more moist conditions without severe storms, then we can often get really good results. This is a key theme that runs through all the literature and the Bayer reports, is that the variability of precipitation is basically the key thing that's going to determine whether or not seeding is going to be effective. And a point that wasn't shown on the data here is that of all the regions of the western United States, it is shown in Donna's paper, it's along the West Coast where you see the highest number of studies showing effectiveness of seeding. And that's probably due to the weather patterns being a little more conducive to a more gentle kind of moisture, not the thunderstorms that are so common in the Southwest. So the managers recommend utilizing more effective application techniques and applying alternative treatments. This can come back again to treatments like mulch, and increased monitoring, and then we recommend increased research on the use of different application approaches. Overall, it is encouraging that in the last decade or so, we've moved to having an increased number of high and highest quality research studies on post-fire seeding. So we know a lot more. Basically, as we discussed with the literature review or the systematic review, what we are finding is somewhat less support for the effectiveness of post-fire seeding. But it would be very useful, especially because we continue to carry out these activities, to have even more well-designed experiments and longer-term monitoring to try to come up with better answers to these questions. And in particular, it's important now to try to look at the effects of seeding with native species, because we're trying to move in that direction. You can see from the trends in post-fire seeding that we are making some success at moving in that direction, but we don't necessarily know the long-term outcomes. We also don't really know enough about what the the non-native annuals or sterile non-natives, the use of those seeds in post-fire seeding. So that's what we had to present, and still have a few minutes if folks have some questions.
Pete, this is Xander. So would it be fair to say that after doing this review, you would be less enthusiastic about doing post-fire seeding, and you might be more tempted to recommend against it, or try to find other options for soil stabilization after fire?
I would say that would be consistent with what the literature is showing, especially the more recent literature. Rich, are you still on the line? Rich Schwab? I saw that he was on the computer part of this, and I was wondering...
I'm on. I had you on mute.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, you assisted Donna quite a bit with thinking through managers' perspectives and some aspects of this project, and I'm wondering how some of these results look to you in terms of where you see the research taking us with post-wildfire seeding.
Well, it's pretty much going the way that we suspected it would. We've been asking these questions for a long time because this is a significant investment that we've gone through in post-fire activities. I mean, seeding alone is huge. You know, in the Department of Interior in 2007, we spent close to $60 million on post-fire seeding. And it's really no surprise to us, I think, what you have shown us. Of course, I'll be interested in the second part of the study, which is on the rangelands, because that's where a lot of the seeding is taking place. And as you get into those more arid environments, the chances for success seem to be much more limited, you know, obviously related to moisture and whether or not it comes. So we've been looking a lot lately at the species richness issues. I'm glad you're going down that path. So, I mean, overall, I'm just really pleased with what you're showing us. It's going to help us as far as our management decisions.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. It's interesting with the rangelands component of this that on the one hand, they are in more arid environments, as you mentioned, but on the other hand, they're often flatter. They can sometimes use drilling more effectively, drill seeds in rather than aerial broadcasting and so on. I don't know how that's going to turn out. Jan has not yet given us any clues as to what the final result's going to be.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything yet either.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Well, I did have a question on, I mean, what do you think is happening on that year 3 data when it starts dropping off? I mean, species richness is dropping and cover is dropping. You know, do you have any thoughts on that? What's causing that?
Yeah, as to why it declines rather than just stabilizes, because you would you would expect a more stable answer.
Yeah.
The only no, I don't know why that would be happening. And you have to bear in mind that these are the results. That's just showing the center line of this really variable distribution of a whole bunch of studies all around the western United States. But the one thing that that graphic did not show was that just like the managers were commenting that there is not really good long-term monitoring, there's not very much long-term research either. And so if we were to plot out all the individual points of the study sites in year 1, there'd be a lot of them. Year 2, there's a lot of them. Year 3, there's much fewer. By year 4 and 5, it starts to get down to just a handful of sites. So whether that phenomenon is really a biological phenomenon and it's really dropping off, or if it's kind of an artifact because there's very few sites that go out to 4 and 5 years with good quantitative data, I don't know.
Do you think it has anything to do with life form, like annual versus perennial?
That annuals that may have had a lot of cover came in first, some more broad, like ctenopods or something that can really take over an area and have a lot of cover.
Yeah, yeah.
That seems like a logical hypothesis, but I don't know if that's the right answer.
So this is Laura McCarthy. I have a question on a little different train of thinking here, if that's okay.
Sure.
So it was, you know, the sort of take-home message about the effectiveness of seeding was really clear. But I wondered if you could kind of clarify what the take-home message would be regarding the use of or the introduction of non-native and invasive species post-seeding. Because I found the sort of the time split that you showed where, you know, after a certain period there was a lot more native seed used, kind of obscured the answer to that question in my mind. So I wondered if you could just clarify that.
I'm not totally clear if you're asking about the deliberate introduction of non-native species as seeded species or as non-natives that are contaminating the seed mix.
I think, well, I'm both, and I think I'm actually most interested in the contamination question, but also in both.
Okay. Well, contamination is definitely a concern, and my colleague Molly Hunter worked on the Cerro Grande fire. You may be very familiar with this work in the contamination of what is believed to be the contamination of cheatgrass in the grasses that were seeded there.
I've seen the effects. I've read nobody's studies, but it's obvious when you're out there.
Ah, okay. Well, it's been reported, and I would point you to Molly's studies, or to anyone else on the line. If you want to send me an email with a particular question, I'd be happy to give you whatever information I can, and also pass you on to Donna, who could probably answer most of these questions better than I. However, it seems to be very sporadic, and that's the site that comes to mind for the issue, sort of a poster child for the possibility that you can have contamination by invasive non-native species. But there are some very large fires. We've spent several years studying the Rodeo Chediskai fire, biggest fire in the Southwest, about 500,000 acres, and there is really no evidence of contamination of the seed mixes that were used there. And the two different agencies, the White Mountain Apache Tribe and the Forest Service, had two different seed mixes. They broadcast seed over some very large landscapes, and there's basically almost no non-native plant response there. So it seems to be a very variable kind of issue. The question as to whether, for instance, if we deliberately introduce sterile non-natives or annual non-natives with the expectation that they will die out in a few years, that's something that definitely merits more research. And it does not yet show up very well in the research literature, because if we're here in 2010 or last year 2009 looking at published materials, then those are most recently going to have been published in 2008, which means they're really looking at fires from the early 2000s, whereas the use of these sterile or annual non-natives is really very recent. So what we need is more ongoing research and more long-term monitoring of recent fires that have been treated with these kinds of species. It's like the question keeps changing, and so we have to try to stay on top of it with research. I was really encouraged by what Rich Schwab just said about the interest, in his case, in terms of Department of Interior, on trying to follow through on this investment in ecosystem manipulation. I hope that answered a couple of your questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Okay. Xander, it's a couple minutes past 12. I don't know how you want to let people go, or I'm happy to stick around and talk some more, but I don't know how you want to deal with it.
Well, let's let people drop off the line. If we usually shoot for an hour for these webinars, because that seems to be about what people can fit into their schedules. But if people want to stick on the phone and ask Pete some more questions, there may be a few beeps, but other than that, we can just keep going. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us. And if you have colleagues who you think would be interested in this information, we're going to post a recording of the webinar on the Southwest Fire Science Consortium webpage. And so people will be able to access that in one form or another as a follow-up. So thanks a lot, everybody. And if you want to stick on the line, you're welcome to. But if you want to drop off and get back to your day, you're welcome to do that as well.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you to all of you for participating as well. I appreciate it. Well, does anyone have any other questions or anything you'd like to comment from your own experience?
I have to. This is Xander again. That it's fascinating that the systematic review catching that it may not give as a simple review count would indicate, and also that it may uncover a kind of simmering issue that maybe post-fire seeding isn't what we should be.
Xander, the end of your comment got cut off there.
Oh, I was just saying that it's interesting that you may have this may highlight that we really shouldn't be post-fire seeding.
Well, it is interesting how the review process works to let you see some things that are really pretty well known, and then just like the question that Laura was asking about the use of native species and non-native annuals and so on, the things that we really don't know much about.
Yeah.
It's very useful to help guide setting up hypotheses for future research.
Yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to comment on, and there may still be a few folks here working as managers involved in these kinds of processes, that everybody has, one thing is that even though we found somewhat limited effectiveness of post-wildfire seeding, that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of people working as hard as they possibly can to do the very best job they can of post-wildfire seeding. They're really two different things. It's not saying that people aren't doing a good job of those activities, but rather that in some cases they really don't work in the manner that they're intended. And the other thing I want to mention is, again, going back to the variability in these findings that you see in the literature, well, in some places it works great. And some individuals and some people's experiences have been such that, well, I worked on these 3 fires and I think we had really good results. And that could well be the case because the results are all across the board. And so the variability is extraordinarily high in what people are finding in post-fire seeding results.
Is it hard to sort of tease out where the conditions for success, because there just aren't enough studies in enough different places to build a case for, oh, well, if you're in this sort of environment, then it's going to be successful?
Well, you know, really, ultimately, I think the single most challenging thing is the connection to precipitation and moisture. And, you know, when you were asking whether one would recommend post-fire seeding or not, if you could tell me what the amount and intensity of rainfall was going to be for the next 6 months after my fire, then I'd be more than happy to make a recommendation. The absence of being able to predict that future, that it's hard to say. But you know, like for instance, if you were to look at where we are right now in the Southwest, we're moving out of El Nino conditions and into La Nina conditions. So even at a sort of a first cut, one might think that perhaps you would expect that seeding done this summer in 2010 might have less chance of success than seeding that would have been done last summer in 2009. I mean, that's a really crude way to try to express the probabilities, but
that might be the best we could hope for.
That might be the best we would know, yeah.
Given that we can't predict what the temperature is going to be tomorrow.
Indeed.
Well, Pete, thank you so much. I think we're probably talking after everybody else has left, but I think you did a great job, and I think it was a great webinar.
Well, thanks, Xander. I really appreciate you pulling this together for the consortium, and this was fun. Be happy to do something like this again.
Yep, Pete, this is Rich Schwab. I would say.
Thanks, Rich. I'm really glad that you could participate.
Uh-huh. I did have one question on Rodeo Chesca. I know you've done a lot of work on that one, and having a personal connection there, spending a lot of time there myself. Are you going to be doing anything with that data as far as publishing it?
Well, we published 2 papers from the Rodeo Chesca, and the one that focuses on revegetation issues was published by Amanda Kenzie. I'd be happy to email it to you if you don't have a copy. And it was on the White Mountain Apache lands.
Okay.
Is that where you were working, or did you work on both
Yes,
sides?
that's when I was with the BIA.
Yeah. So Jim Utes helped get the whole project put into place,
right.
Including Amanda's data. And the really encouraging thing about her data were that we saw very little dominance by non-native species, invasive or even non-invasive non-native species, in the first 3 years after the fire. Right now, we have a brand new project and a new graduate student who's working this summer on relocating those plots and remeasuring them. We were out there a couple weeks ago and found a bunch of the plots, and those data are going to be a little more mixed. I mean, we'll have to see how it all turns out, but there's definitely some presence of non-natives. But again, you know, kind of falling, I'd still say pretty much a native-dominated community both on the Forest Service side and the White Mountain Apache side. So we'll
great.
those results are probably going to be another year away. But
All right.
I'll send you Amanda's paper.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Xander.
Okay, thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Take care.